April 1945. The war in Europe is down to its final, brutal weeks. The greatest invasion force in history, the Western Allied armies, has swept across Germany and now stands at the Elbe River, less than 100 miles from Berlin. The path is open, the German resistance is collapsing, and the temptation to capture the capital is immense. But the advance stops. This decision to halt the advance was not a military choice, it was a political one, made in conference rooms far from the smoke of the battlefield. This single moment, the decision to respect a pre-agreed demarcation line, fixed the future borders of Europe for the next 5 decades. But what if General Dwight D. Eisenhower had defied those agreements? What if he had listened to voices like General George S. Patton, who saw communism as the next great threat, and launched a desperate, final dash for Berlin and beyond? The result would have been the fastest, deadliest, and most brutal start to the Cold War imaginable. This is History Reimagined. Welcome to this video, and feel free to share your comments anytime. In our timeline, the official reason the Allies stopped was due to political agreements made earlier in the war. At Yalta and later Potsdam, the major powers, the US, UK, and the Soviet Union, had already divided Germany into occupation zones. Crucially, Berlin, though the capital, was designated as deep inside the Soviet zone. General Eisenhower faced an almost impossible political dilemma, despite the pleas of Winston Churchill, who saw Stalin's ambition clearly. First of all, the battle for Berlin was known to be a brutal, bloody urban fight against fanatical SS units. The intelligence estimates were grim. Allowing the Soviets to take the agreed-upon territory saved what would surely be tens of thousands of American and British lives. Next, in 1945, the primary strategic goal of the United States was now defeating Japan. Every resource, every troop, and every drop of fuel needed to be shifted to the Pacific. Lastly, from political point of view, Eisenhower and President Truman prioritized upholding the Yalta agreements to maintain trust with Stalin, believing, mistakenly, that Soviet cooperation would be essential for forming the United Nations and ensuring post-war stability. So, the Allies stopped at the Elbe to honor a line on a map, but in doing so, they delivered half a continent to Soviet domination. But what if the Allied armies had not stopped at the Elbe? Our point of divergence happens in mid-April 1945. We assume General Patton, perhaps the most vocal anti-communist general, successfully convinces a newly empowered President Truman that the ideological threat from the Soviet Union outweighs the political agreements. The Western Allies decide to risk immediate confrontation to seize territory and political leverage. Instead of holding the line, Eisenhower orders the armies to press forward. The primary goal is a desperate, full-speed dash to Berlin, the political prize. But the secondary, more strategic goal is to liberate key Eastern European cities like Prague and Budapest, aiming to establish a dividing line much further east, perhaps along the Oder or even the Vistula River. The race is on, and the Soviets, who had already committed massive armies and paid in 20 million lives to conquer this territory, are not about to yield. The moment Western troops cross the pre-agreed line, the outcome is catastrophic. Imagine that if Western and Soviet forces meet violently. This scenario immediately plunges the world into a massive, uncontrolled conflict. The Cold War is born hot. The Soviets, viewing the Allied advance as a betrayal and an invasion of territory they consider theirs by right of conquest, do not hesitate. Local, friendly fire. Incidents involving confused or aggressive units quickly escalate along the entire front. The next question is, would this result in a new front? This is not a measured, tactical operation. The front devolves into a massive series of chaotic and deadly military conflicts in the ruins of Germany and Czechoslovakia. Commanders on both sides, operating under extreme political pressure, are forced to make decisions that turn accidents into confrontations. Lastly, this earlier, deeper Allied presence makes a direct, early conflict, like the one Churchill had secretly planned for, called Operation Unthinkable, a horrifyingly real and immediate possibility, fought on the ruins of Germany. Millions of men, still fully armed and battle-hardened, would clash in a final, brutal contest for Europe. So, would this lead to a different Europe? Yes, we believe that despite the high cost, the military push fundamentally alters the geography of Europe. If the Allies manage to take Berlin, Germany is unified under Western, democratic control, or at least partitioned much further east. There is no Berlin Wall running through the middle of the city, and the Iron Curtain is drawn across the heart of Poland, not Germany. And Western troops succeed in liberating or influencing Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and possibly parts of Poland. These nations do not fall into the Soviet sphere of influence and become a genuine democratic buffer state. This would result a new line of division runs dramatically along the Oder or even the Vistula River, shrinking the size of the future Warsaw Pact to only Russia and a few compliant neighbors. Millions of Eastern Europeans are spared decades of Soviet control, fundamentally changing the future of the continent. On top of the altered map of Europe, we believe the biggest consequence would be the accelerated nuclear arms race. The Soviet Union, feeling threatened, betrayed, and encircled, becomes even more isolationist and aggressively paranoid under Stalin. They view the US as an enemy that cannot be trusted under any circumstances. They pour every available resource into their nuclear program, making the world reach the era of mutually assured destruction, much faster than in our timeline. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, forms almost instantly in 1945 or 1946, not 1949, because the threat is already a proven reality. Western Europe is immediately and heavily rearmed with American support, turning Europe into a permanent, heavily armed frontier. Lastly, we also think the US loses the moral high ground. By unilaterally breaking wartime agreements, even if done to combat communism, the US paints itself as the aggressor against a wounded Soviet Union, potentially alienating allies and strengthening anti-American sentiment globally. The decision to stop at the Elbe was the political price paid for a peaceful, if tense, end to the fighting in Europe. Pushing past it would have undoubtedly gained territory and potentially liberated millions, but it would have cost countless more lives, plunging the world into a massive new hot conflict before World War II was even officially closed. The peace of 1945 was bought at the cost of Eastern European freedom. So, this raises critical questions about power and morality. Would a smaller Soviet bloc have ultimately meant a weaker Soviet Union, or a stronger, more centralized, and even more ruthlessly dedicated one? In that chaotic 1945 scenario, could the US have used the threat of the atomic bomb to deter the Soviets, or would that have been too high a price to pay for Eastern European freedom? This is History Reimagined. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to share your comments and subscribe.